Welcome to the Strategy Table. We look to explore the world of public relations. I'm your host, Priyank, and I'm joined by Michael.
And I'm Michael Deval Montgomery. Before I was in PR, I was a journalist. I was the gatekeeper, deciding what was a story and what was not, what was just a game-changing new logo. I've spent years fielding thousands of PR pitches, so I now come at this with a lot of skepticism.
So, Michael, we've worked together. A lot of companies reach out to, especially you as a journalist, a lot of companies would reach out to you thinking, I have this very interesting update. I'm launching an app update or a product feature. And you must have received something like 100 emails or pitches on a daily basis. How many pitches would you receive?
I received thousands of pitches, and it's important to highlight that journalists are very overworked, and this is misunderstood. They're very tired and time poor. And so our job is to bridge that gulf between the clients, businesses, and the newspapers. And it can be very chaotic. And frankly, I think most people have no idea about the reality of the way the media works.
So let's demystify the newsroom, right? Because for a lot of people, it's like, people have their heads down, they're writing stories, they're out there meeting CEOs, they're trying to wait in bars to get a scoop. How does the newsroom work? Pull back the curtain and explain how a newsroom is run, especially when you were a single journalist in most of your newsrooms, but please.
Yeah, that's a great question. The honest answer is that I felt a bit like a restaurant critic, where the process starts days, weeks, or months in terms of the preparation, and the journalist or the critic turn up just to see the final dish when it's served and make a judgment about it.
It's funny because on the PR side, there's an invisible army of marketing and communications people working around to come up with content plans and what could be exciting to a journalist, who it should be sent to. At what stage of the process did you feel involved?
Well, I became obsessed with this idea of what happened before I got there. Who designed the kitchen? Who put together the menu? Where were the ingredients sourced? And it made me want to understand more about the process leading up to the point when businesses and publicists engaged journalists and editors. And that was the beginning of my interest in joining the PR world and eventually joining the dark side.
So I'm sensing this deep-seated passion. So it's not just the money. You joined sort of the PR side of things to further what you wanted to do with your career.
Okay, I came to the conclusion that the real power and intellectual challenge was not just analyzing a narrative that had been given to you, but shaping it from the beginning. To get on the ground floor and not just write a review, but to frame the entire conversation. So
obviously very different from the press release or the invite you received. You really wanted to get the story behind the story.
That's a good question, which is the story behind the story, what you see versus what the reality is.
Yeah.
Sausage factory.
You've been a journalist out of Hong Kong with the South China Morning Post. You were a tech reporter, I think, with... I think that's how we met. I sent you a pitch and you came to one of my press events. I think it was for an accelerator. And you also reported out of the UK. What's your experience been being a journalist?
That's a very broad question, but I'd say one of the things I miss a lot about being a journalist was access. You get access to all the decision makers. You can meet the CEOs. You have teams of handlers around you when you arrive at an event. You're treated like a VIP everywhere you go in terms of when you're working. But the flip side of that as well is it's transactional. A lot of people that you think are your friends or are close relationships often fizzle out or disappear when you stop being a journalist. And recently with the TechCrunch layoffs, we've seen some of the former TechCrunch reporters, without naming individuals, commenting on this on social media, that they've been surprised that the networks that they had built over a decade suddenly were not responding to their messages. It can be transactional. So I think firstly, the access, the VIP treatment is incredible. The downside is it's ultimately quite transactional, and you often only notice that after you leave.
Which is interesting because on the other side of the coin in PR, sometimes you just feel like you're everyone's bitch, right? I mean, let's be real. You are always asking media if they'll cover a story, and you believe that they should, and they still say, please, you followed up with me. We're working on it. And then some clients will often ask, what's the ROI? And of course, in PR, it's very difficult to share what's the return on investment because in earned, it's very much, if you think of the concept of a sales funnel, right? PR is very much awareness and getting leads into the sales funnel where, people may not have heard about you or your product and now they do. And because it's by a credible news source, they want to work with you. On the other side, it builds trust, so they're more keen to buy your product or work with you, right? That's that hygiene factor. But in PR, you just feel like you are everyone's bitch. You are answering client, what's ROI? Media will be sort of pushing back. And between it all, you're just anxious and stressed. And it's interesting comparing to your journalism experience where you had teams of handlers, probably PR people, looking after you. Was that such a substantial fall from grace, you feel?
Well, I will respond to that by sharing a recent discussion I had with somebody who wanted to understand what the feedback was from an editor when we sent a pitch or a press release. And having been in newsrooms myself, having sat in editorial meetings, having watched as 10 or 20 of the most senior editors in a 100-person newsroom get up and go to their twice daily editorial meeting to make big decisions on that day's coverage, I was aware that the reason that certain stories are chosen over others often happen behind closed doors. Editors often don't explain to PR people why they've not taken a pitch. It could be just simply because of the news cycle that day. It could be because they've had a change of editors who doesn't want to cover a certain topic as much as the previous editor. And ultimately, there's a lot of luck involved and a lot of chance involved in public relations and in dealing with news outlets. So I was having to explain to this person that unfortunately, it's not always possible to get reasons for why some stories get through and some don't. And that's difficult. Businesses are used to certainty. They're used to black and white. They're used to getting black and white data to inform their decisions. And media is very chaotic. And often they have to accept the fact that there's no good feedback for why something in PR marketing didn't work, especially when you're not dealing with pay to play. You're not dealing with spending ad dollars to get a certain result. You're dealing with a very nebulous and, like I said, chaotic process of going to newsrooms, going to journalists who then have to go up to editors, who then in some cases have to deconflict with sales teams who may have a relationship with brands, who then have to go up and maybe be vetoed by an editor-in-chief. So yeah, this is something that's an educational process for businesses. And for us, it's sometimes difficult to explain the success or failure of different campaigns.
It sounds like PR, it's not an easy business, though it's a business. And it's really interesting to hear some of it demystified because clients often wonder what's the update on things. And it's not so easy to just have a simple update. It's not just I spoke to the journalist. Like, for instance, recently we met with one of the top business media, one of the editors there, right? And this person was sharing that, sometimes the HK bureau might not be inclined to cover a story, whereas the editor out of the UK or another news desk might cover the story. So a lot of it does come down to chance and luck. You're very right. I wanted to just switch gears a bit. You must have interviewed hundreds of CEOs across Southeast Asia and Asia. Which are some of the sort of famous ones that come to mind, and what would they like?
That's a great question. I remember dealing with Anthony Tan a few times, the founder of Grab. And Anthony had invited a bunch of us journalists to a press conference around 2015 before Uber acquired, I think, 30% of their business and left the region. And it was a challenging time for ride hailing because there had been some difficulties with vetting of drivers, and keeping people safe basically had become a top priority for these companies. And the journalists and the media were well aware that there were incidents going on, and people like Anthony and Grab had to be extra careful to communicate the safety of their platform. And I asked about this. I asked about driver checks. And to their credit, they've done a great job on this. But in the early days, in 2015, 2016, it was clear that Anthony's comms team had not properly prepared him to field questions on driver safety and passenger safety.
Well, was this around the time Uber had a lot of issues in India?
India and China with Didi Chuxing at the time, they had incidents, and media were aware of this. And so that was one example of a very competent founder and CEO who had just not been prepared properly for a curveball question from a journalist, but should have been pretty obvious given the climate and given the media reporting globally that had been going on for months at that point. But to give Anthony a lot of credit, he's a very classy guy. He met me many years later at a conference and remembered my name and said hi. And so I got the impression from Anthony he really cared about building relationships with journalists. He wasn't somebody who wanted to be transactional and was just shuffled in and out of meetings with the media. He took the time to get to know the individuals behind the bylines and behind the reporting. Secondly, I remember asking Anthony about Travis Kalanick, who was the founder of Uber in the US, and what he thought about him and how much attention he was paying to what he was doing. And Anthony said very clearly, and this became the headline of my VentureBeat story, I don't think about Travis Kalanick. And that was a great way, talking about deflecting and ping in the bud a line of inquiry, which a journalist may get. You've answered the question and it's honest, and you can then move on to the next question. And it was a very powerful statement. It suggested that he was confident in his own strategy. He didn't want to pay attention to what competitors were doing. It was a distraction to him. So my point of sharing these two stories is that I think CEOs can be both masterful in controlling parts of interviews, and they can also struggle in the same session with other parts of the interview. And so our job as publicists is to ensure that hopefully it's a great performance across the board, and A, execs are prepared for curveball questions, and B, if they are strong in some areas such as controlling the conversation and deflecting, and that they lean into those skills and don't become flustered if they're unsure how to deal with a difficult question.
It's interesting, right? Because to just distill what you shared, it seems the more authentic and the more they invest in a relationship, the more the affinity. And that's also where you got your best content, which was the headline that you came up with, which I remember was trending and got a lot of clicks, your article. I remember reading it. You also have other stories where you have CEOs or marketing teams trying to wine and dine you. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, journalists are used to this, especially executives or companies from different cultures. They approach business in different ways. Some of them are very transparent about sort of offering to take you to Michelin restaurants, to buy you expensive experiences. And that's just something that journalists need to judge for themselves and have to deal with. It's pretty obvious when you come across these offers as a journalist that there's something expected in exchange. If they take you for a $1,000 Michelin meal, they hope to get some positive coverage. And you may say, well, there's nothing wrong with that. But of course, journalists are supposed to disclose these sorts of things and adhere to journalistic ethics. And ideally, you would avoid those kind of exchanges because it can create claims or perceptions of biased reporting or being in the pocket of certain companies, which can then tarnish the publication more broadly. And I think it's reasonable that if this goes on too much, journalists could face being fired or scrutinized by their editors or by other people in the organization or externally. And plenty of journalists have had to leave their jobs because of accepting these sorts of transactions. Whether or not they're actually bribes is open to debate, but perception of wrongdoing can be as bad as genuinely providing favorable reporting in exchange for gifts or experiences.
It makes you appreciate the transparency in Singapore, like with SPH. Anything above $80 has to be declared and just gets left in a section of the building and is unclaimed. I remember meeting with Bloomberg for a few times for coffee, and they would pay for my coffee. We weren't allowed to buy them coffee. They obviously have a very high standard of professionalism. But I mean, the culture in some countries, there is a red packet system, there is an expectation. But thankfully in Singapore, Southeast Asia, it's good content. Like you were talking about authentic, good content and access to the decision maker. And that's what always wins. Even if you get 100 pitches, good content always cuts through.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, journalists are consumers of the news just like a publicist or a CEO is. And if they're interested in a story that they click into to read more, in many ways that dynamic is the exact same thing that happens when they open their inbox and they click into an email. They see a fascinating subject line, they read the first paragraph, and they're compelled to keep reading. They want to find out more. It's human. It's very natural human behavior. And too many people think about journalists or editors as some mysterious contraption that they need to decode. The best example of how to understand this that I ever got was from my editor at the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, who said, if you ever want to know what the headline of your story is, let's just say you've witnessed a emergency response by the police, or you've seen a crash on the road, or something's happened, you've written a story about it, and you want to explain to your spouse or your sibling or your friend when you get home that evening or over a drink at a bar, what's the first sentence you tell them? That tends to be the human instinct, the most important or interesting part of the story. And that human response to an experience tends to form the best headlines as well. And when you're trying to pitch a client's or a company's or a business's story to an editor, you have to go through that process in your head. What's the most interesting thing here? How can I put that front and center right in the subject line of email or in the first 10 seconds of a call when I speak to an editor?
It's interesting. Just, the thought process as a publicist, and that's the thought process as a journalist and an editor, right? As a publicist, press releases as a format of media communications has not changed in structure since the very first press release in the early 1900s. The very first press release was about a train accident. It was very factual. 50 people have died. This is where it happened. This is what happened. And it's just getting the facts in a headline worthy or like a single line that captures the essence of the event. And what you're talking about is very similar. The other side of that story where, truly distilling down an event or a press release or anything into something that you can go home and tell your partner is I still can't explain to my family or my partner what PR is and what I do. Can you?
It's difficult.
Why is that?
My go-to response is brands, businesses, investors to be seen with peers in the media. So if you're a CEO of a Fortune 500, for example, and you see Jamie Dimon on CNBC in the Financial Times every week, your human response is, can I be involved in those conversations? Can I be seen with my peer? In this case, it's somebody like Jamie Dimon talking about the economy, talking about government policy. I'm part of the Fortune 500. Why can't I be up there with him? And the way he can do that is to turn to his comms or PR team and tell them, I want to be in those conversations. And we do the same for thousands or hundreds of companies around Asia who are not necessarily in the Fortune 500, and they're not necessarily benchmarking themselves against somebody like Jamie Dimon, but they want to be seen in their peer group in the same media that their peers, their business peers, are being seen in. And it's basically, at its most basic, it's FOMO. It's, he's in there, why can't I be in there? My business is no less impressive or important than their business, and I want a slice of the conversation. And so that's a long answer, but in short, it's helping businesses to be part of the conversations that they care about in the media, whether it's a newspaper, television program, radio program, in the media that they care about and where their peers are.
Exactly. I think being part of the conversation is very important. And that's how, in Singapore, for instance, they have a lot of these sandboxes for fintech, for healthcare, for medtech. And just being part of the conversation puts you on the radar with not just customers, but regulators. And that's very important because that's one of the main sort of streams for future revenue. Being part of the conversation is half the battle. That's what you call relevance. The other part is what differentiates you from the rest.
You'll be surprised. Government policymakers, regulators, people who legislate and introduce laws into countries, in many ways, they're just like you and I. They go home at night. They pull up the Financial Times or Bloomberg, they read the headlines, and sure, they're getting very sophisticated briefings from their teams. In some cases, they have access to classified information, but for the most part, they're consuming the news in the same way that a CEO or a student or anyone else is. And the chance for brands to influence narratives around their sector or their product or their service is very powerful when they are able to indirectly reach these policymakers and regulators through the media they're consuming. And there's plenty of new innovation and technology, which is very disruptive. And as everyone knows, governments are always lagging technology. In some cases, they're many years behind with bringing regulations in line with where technology is. And so they're taking months and years to try to understand these new technologies, primarily through digesting news. And so the chance here is for the CEO of an innovative, disruptive business to put forward their case for why their product or service is revolutionary, why it's important, why it should be regulated favorably. And this can result in legislation really being shaped differently versus if those CEOs had not put forward their case in the media.
It's a recurring theme where sort of regulations always playing catch up with innovation. It's interesting, like we've met with so many different heads of communications with one of the largest institutional investors in the world. The head of communications basically said that my CEO, the 3 or 5 news articles that they consume, it's pulled up by the comms team. It's always a news article that they then flag. And that's the only, the CEO has many different things to do for the day, and that's the only news that they consume. And that shapes their perception of their industry.
You've raised a very important point, and this ties back to the question of news monitoring and media monitoring, which is a key part of what we do in PR agencies and as publicists. I recently had coffee with one of the communications leaders at one of the largest hedge funds and financial market makers in the world, and they said that as an observation on the role of AI in media monitoring, that AI is great, but AI will give her 100 or 50 news articles to read per day based on what she asks it to find. Where the value really is for her is a human team that spends hours every day going through all this news, all this media reports over the last 24 hours, telling her that these are the 5 pieces out of the 100 that she absolutely has to read and that she has to get her CEO to read. And unfortunately, this is still a labor-intensive human part of the PR puzzle, which has not yet been taken over by AI. And she engages a public relations agency purely to do this daily media monitoring exercise, which she finds so invaluable and has not been automated successfully yet.
So you've received, so on a typical day, you used to receive 80 to 100 pitches from PR people and in-house teams. And over your career, you've received a few thousand pitches. Any memorable ones?
I mean, I've got a few observations to make. Firstly, I had plenty of people that were basically giving me dirt on competitors. They wanted their competitors to be slandered in the media.
In Southeast Asia.
In Southeast Asia and China. And the difficult, very difficult part for the journalist is A, journalists compete with other journalists, so they always want an exclusive. B, they want to be factual. And oftentimes, when there is real dirt on a company, and you approach that company as a journalist for comment, they don't comment. You face a very difficult challenge and balancing act, which is this source is credible. I think the claims are likely to be accurate based on the information I've seen, and the company is not commenting. You know there's a margin of error here. It's possible you may misreport something. So this is something I had to deal with a number of times. In most of the cases, I decided not to pursue and publish these leaks, if you would like to call them that. But there was a few cases where I thought there was a public interest case. In one case, I had been specifically told by one of the ride-hailing company's executives that there had been a assault and police investigation, and it was not public. And I decided to report that without naming any executive, but I put it down as a very good source within the company. On another case, there had been a police raid on an office, which I'd heard from multiple sources had happened. It was a prominent technology company, and I believe I did report that at the time. And then there was also cases where I definitely did not trust the source and I did not pursue the story. Generally, this is the case when the person has a reputation for leaking. He is obviously a competitor of the companies whose information he is leaking. It doesn't seem particularly public interest. It seems like he's basically going after competitors and trying to use the media as a tool. So one of the challenges of being a journalist is to have good judgment on when you're just being used versus when there's a genuine public interest story to pursue.
I mean, we do get requests, which of course we don't pursue, but people just want to, if you will call it weaponized media coverage, they want coverage on the company so they can fool more people into signing deals or fool more investors into signing a term sheet, right?
Well, maybe this is a good question for you. So I was the journalist who received the leaks. I'm sure as a publicist, you've had to deal with a number of situations where companies, CEOs or comms people have come to you and said, you know, information has been leaked. We may face a PR crisis if this is published. How do you handle those scenarios?
Well, of course, the very first thing is information gathering, right? Get all the facts. And once you have all the facts, you're in a better position to make a decision. Of course, time is of the essence. The next is once you've collected the facts, you will have a decision tree. If it's very condemning for a company, then the goal is really, something's going to happen. It's really how do you make yourself, you're not going to be loved, but how do you make yourself less hated if something comes out? And then how do you quickly get through the phase to reputation recovery? Whereas if you feel you're on the side that's right, it's very important that you get information out that controls it. You can control how your brand is viewed. Recently we worked at a company where we had financial audits. We were very transparent with our journalists that had received information that was leaked, and we were like, you can talk to the biggest investor in the company, or you can talk directly to the CEO, or you can talk to all these third parties, right? the person who's trying to leak stuff is obviously, has a reason, is obviously dissatisfied with their, in this case, their employment at the company.
They have an agenda.
They're very motivated because they have an agenda, right? So I think media, they can be reasoned with. And that's where a good PR person comes in. How do you balance a journalist where they want to be the first to break something, to be, to leak the next e-fishery scandal, for instance, versus, these are the facts and, make what you will of it, but this is what is true and right. And you should, if you do a lot of fact checking, you'll realize that your source is very motivated, has an agenda, and, in this case, the journalist killed the story. But it's something we see a lot. On the other side, we also see some investors saying, or some scale-ups where they come to us saying, look, we've received the first signatory on a term sheet. We need to demonstrate business momentum to see a few more signatures. Can you help with that? And PR can't be ahead of the business. We can't say, this company is on a track to be $1 billion company. We report after the fact, which is we've received the first close of the round. Technically, that's correct because they had cash in the bank in this case. It does communicate momentum. We can't say that we are on track to 10x the company. We journalists and media, they trust us to vet and quality control a company. We are one of the reasons that they carry a press release, especially, some agencies that have spent years and just really focused on just trust and building trust with clients and media. You can't erode that trust by not, checking your sources. You have to, any information we get from clients, firstly, even before a pitch, we might see the financials and just vet them to know that, it's not like, previously I've worked with Ponzi schemes and we didn't know it was. So we obviously have to do more due diligence. And then after the fact, we really, anything that we're given, we have to really fact check. So if we're given data that shows, why a company's product is so remarkable, we like to look at the raw data. We look at the surveys. We look at the Excel sheet, which shows all the data. And then we say, okay, yes, it's true. Or, hey, this is an even better story. So we also work with the marketing team or the founder to come up with the strongest angles and narrative that makes their brand looks the best it can. Thank you for tuning in to the first episode of the Strategy Table. If you liked what you saw or listened to, feel free to like or subscribe. We are just a comment or an email away if you have questions. You have thoughts, you disagree or hopefully agree with things we said. We'd love to have a conversation. Like the prediction, everything's going to happen in the real world.